had several main concerns that you talked a lot about. Is that, well, that one student like wouldn't leave for lunch. I had another student who was the student that typically came into class, paid attention, figured out the procedures, solved the problems. And this student had a meltdown. Like I gave that same task and they didn't know what to do. And they just had this meltdown. And I didn't have any guidance to know, like, what do I do about that? And I didn't know anything about.
You're listening to a snippet of our conversation with Michael Rubin, a math moment maker who's been diving into a ton of math professional learning over the past year as he gears up to make a return to the math classroom.
Join in on the conversation as Michael shares his recent successes, learning from the many math educators sharing online, our weekly tasks, tips, tools, weekly email, as well as some epiphanies he's had since taking our online workshop recently.
Are you ready to dive into another amazing math mentoring moment episode?
I know I sure am. And guess what? There was so much goodness happening in this conversation that we had to split it into 2 parts. Hit it!
Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce from tapintoteenminds.com.
And I'm John Orr from mrorr-isageek.com. We are 2 math teachers who, together,
with you, the community of math educators worldwide who want to build and deliver lessons that spark engagement,
fuel learning,
and ignite teacher action. Welcome to episode number 40. How do I know when to proceed or pivot my plan? Another math mentoring moment episode. This time, we'll be hanging out with Michael Rubin from Northern California. Let's do this!
The conversation we have here with Michael drops a ton of great ideas, thoughts, and takeaways for your classroom. He also mentions how transformative his experience in our 6-module online workshop was for pushing his math content knowledge and pedagogical practice forward. Are you ready to do a deep dive with us like Michael did this last fall?
We run the online workshop twice a year, once in the spring and once in the fall. So fall 2019 registration will be opening on Friday, September 13th and closing on Friday, September 27th. Learn more at makemathmoments.com/online workshop.
And if taking a deep dive alone isn't enough, the workshop is accredited for 2 to 4 PD credit hours through Brandman University. If you're interested in learning more about registering, be sure to check out makemathmoments.com/online workshop. If you're listening after the fall 2019 registration closes, you can still head to makemathmoments.com/online workshop to join the waiting list in order to get notified for your next opportunity to participate.
That is, again, makemathmoments.com/online workshop.
And now, here's our chat with Michael.
Michael, welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are so excited to have you with us today. And actually, we can see you, which typically we can't see guests. But today, we actually have Michael on the screen with us. I'm sporting like a t-shirt because I just got a baseball practice with my son. And John is rocking in the basement. We'll probably see his cat walk by in the next couple minutes. Usually your cat's kind of hanging from something out in there. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. I did my hair. It's going to be on video, so that was good.
Awesome job.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Awesome. Can you just let our listeners know, well, just a little bit about yourself, where you're from, what's your teaching role, and maybe a little bit of background on why you became a math teacher?
Yeah. So I'm in Northern California. I teach in the city south of San Francisco. So I've been doing that since 2007 now. I guess about myself, I'll just start kind of from the beginning. It's kind of a downer to start with, but it's actually, I think, one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And I think that'll come out too. And it has determined a lot of what's happened in my life. So I was actually born with a degenerative heart disease. And I think the first thing where that helped me is I grew up always knowing that I wanted to do something purposeful. I wanted to help people. When I was really little, I wanted to be a lawyer and ended up deciding not to do that. And that probably was one of the first things that led me to teaching, because I felt like I could really make an impact on the future there. I also struggled a lot in elementary school and even through some of middle school. And I didn't start actually liking math or getting math until high school. And once that started happening, I noticed that I could really kind of understand where other people struggled with things. And so I was tutoring other kids and helping them out. And I think that also kind of led me to this idea of wanting to become a teacher, thinking that that was something where I could help. So I got my teaching credential, but the heart disease had progressed to a point where I couldn't teach full time, which at the time I thought wasn't a good thing because it was harder to get a job teaching part time. So I basically took the job that I could get, which now I'm really grateful for. I ended up teaching 3 classes of English language learners. And it's also the school where I probably would not have been working had I been able to work full time, where I met my wife. So that was a blessing. And so I taught from about 2007 to 2016 when I just couldn't, like the stamina issues had made it so that I couldn't give my kids what I wanted. And I had a really supportive district. So I ended up becoming a math TOSA. They're working primarily with our special education teachers, trying to bring the RSP classes up to speed with Common Core, particularly with some of the math practices and how to implement them in their classes. And I had a heart transplant this last September.
Wow.
So I am planning on going back to teaching in August.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah,
And, that's quite the journey.
Yeah.
Like
I wrote it down because I needed to abbreviate it.
Yeah. I'm sure, but I don't even know what you say to that. So you literally had a heart transplant, and I have to know, so how is everything with that? Is everything kind of as great as it could possibly be? How are you feeling? Are you feeling more energetic now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm feeling great. If you're going to have a degenerative heart disease, I couldn't recommend it enough.
Just do a little quick swap there, eh? And,
right.
Start fresh. Wow,
that's amazing.
That is amazing. Just you think about, I'm big into energy and universe, and I'll say this, I believe in it, and I don't necessarily always do what's best for myself, right? In terms of thinking positive, I try to. But when you talk about how things have turned out for you, right? When you said you met your wife, was it at the school? Is she a teacher at the school?
Yep.
So you met your wife at the school that you basically would have only been at if you had this sort of condition, right?
Yeah,
and then now things have sort of...
I was teaching at another... Sorry to interrupt you. I was teaching at another school in the district, and they had position cuts. And I'd actually been there before some other teachers, but because I was part-time, I wasn't tenured yet. And so it forced me to look somewhere else. So I went to another school in the same district. If I were working part-time, I would have had tenure. I wouldn't have left that school. I probably wouldn't have met my wife.
It's
Holy smokes.
Yeah, it's amazing. The small little choices we think are insignificant become huge and life-changing for us. I've got a few of those myself, but nothing compared to yours for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I have actually, again, it's when you hear a story like that, and then it's everybody has that something in their life that sort of things happened, and, everybody says things happen for a reason. And again, the little choices we make really have a big impact, or the situations we're in. So the idea is that you're going to be coming back in August. Sounds like you have an early start compared to us Ontario boys over here, where we get to kind of cruise into September past the Labor Day weekend. You're coming in early August, being in Northern California.
Yep. But we got out in late May. So,
Yeah, so you've already been having a little bit of fun. John and I are still hacking away here.
Yeah.
Well, we want to know, how about what is your most memorable moment from math class? When you think back to math class, what is that moment that sort of pops into your mind? Go ahead and share that with the audience and let us know, or let us into, I guess, a little bit of your past K through 12 math experience.
I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, and every time you ask that question, I ask myself that same question, and I try to come up with something new every time. So I've settled on one, because I thought, if I'm ever on the podcast, I got to have one. And I like this one because it's kind of both good and bad. People talk about good experiences they've had or bad experiences they've had. And, like most of us, I had a very traditional educational experience, the 20 minutes going over homework, the 20 minutes new material being presented, and then 20 minutes doing homework. And I tended to excel in that a little bit as one of those kids that liked math. And we had a sub one day in the 11th grade. And the students wanted to go over the homework, but the sub was a health teacher and hadn't done math in a long time, especially not junior level math. So I just raised my hand and said, I'll go over the homework. And I ended up getting to the front of the board and explaining all the problems and answering questions and doing all that. And in a good way, that kind of validated some of my ideas of wanting to become a teacher. I felt comfortable up in front of other people. I felt comfortable with the math. I felt really good that I was helping some people. But on the other hand, I think that the negative part of that experience was it kind of reinforced for me the idea that being a teacher was this like transference of knowledge. Like I've got the solution pathway and the methods in my head, and being a teacher is just explaining it in such a way that it will fit neatly in your head. And I carried that with me for a long time. So I think if I had to settle on one memorable math moment, that one was always stuck with me.
That's really interesting. I think if you think back to it now, maybe I might agree, maybe not. I'm picturing you as, this student up there and doing the teaching. I'm wondering now whether like a moment like that was the moment where you probably learned the most ever, like in one sort of spot in math class. If you really think about this idea that you got to go up there and essentially have to like think things through and have to like make sense of it enough to try to help others make sense of it. It's like that whole metacognition piece and essentially teaching others, that reciprocal teaching sort of idea there.
Yeah. And I noticed that also, and I'm sure any teacher listening to this notices the same thing, that when you have to explain something or try to tool into somebody else's head to figure out what they're struggling with and how they're going to make that conceptual connection, figure out that relationship or whatever it is, you really need to understand it and make sense of it yourself. I know you guys talk a lot about that, knowing the curriculum and the connections.
For sure.
It almost makes me think now that I have to be like a professional in psychology, right? It's like I have to, like you just said, like you want to imagine putting what is the best way that this can fit in their brain. It's like I have to understand how that kid's brain is going to work, but also like what is all around that kid that is impeding on his ability to learn. Like there's so much that we have to know as our educators. And I'm imagining you as a student standing up there, and now all of a sudden it's just like that hits you. It's like all of these kids are now looking at me, and that kid's doing that over there and that kid's doing that over there, and I'm trying to help them with their homework, and it hits you like a ton of bricks. Like I'm sure it hits so many brand new teachers that there is so much more than just knowing the content and also just knowing like good strategies to teach math. There's so many
and like
more.
Seeing it your way, right? It's like you see it a certain way, and typically, and it's like, what if somebody else saw it some other way? And you're like, oh goodness, I never thought about that, right?
Right. It's just like the socioeconomic around that. Like it's just so much and lots to always learn every single day. Michael, do you mind, we dive a little deeper into you. Do you mind sharing, let's think about your teaching now, a recent success in your math class? I know that you've been off for a little bit, but if you think back to some of your teaching experiences, what would be a recent success in your math class? Do you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, and I tend to think of the last year that I taught, I had one class. It was for English language learners. And I had been a very traditional teacher, and a social studies teacher, a friend of mine said, hey, have you seen this guy, Dan Meyer? He's got this TEDx talk, like math class needs a makeover. And I'm like, no, what's that? So I went ahead and I watched it, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is so awesome. Like I have to do this in my class. I'm kind of an overachiever when it comes to things like that. So I was like, I'm not using anybody else's. I'm going to make my own. So I spent like 18 hours coming up with my own videos and learning how to do all that stuff. And I remember coming up with two. One was the classic like stacking cup system of equations. Like you've got these cups, one with different lip heights or whatever. One, will they be the same? And the other one was the toothpick staircase, where you could model the linear growth versus a quadratic, depending on whether you were looking at like the perimeter, the number of sticks, or the number of cubes or whatever. And I had some really cool success with that. I had kids that just tough to work with. Like they didn't want to be there. They weren't engaged. They didn't like the way that math was taught. And all of a sudden, like I had this one student who I struggled with building a connection with this student, trying to get her to work a little bit harder. And I gave her this task, and we were on a rotational schedule at the time, and it just fell before lunch. And I was getting ready to go to lunch after class, and she wouldn't leave. She just wouldn't leave. She's like, I have to finish this problem. She wouldn't leave. And that engagement was so cool to me. I was like, I got to keep doing this. But, it was so overwhelming because it was taking me 18 hours to make these lessons. So that was like probably one of the best successes that kind of motivated me going into the TOSA role, the teacher on special assignment role. When I was thinking, like, I want to be able to do more of that.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I hear a lot of John and I in that scenario. I remember the same thing. I'm like, and I remember Dan saying it, like, you've got this technology in your pocket, like, go do something with it. And I remember thinking like, oh man, I'm going to do everything this way. And, I spent a lot of time early on, and I think it was all time well spent. I would definitely advocate that people engage in that learning, but at the same time, it might not be sustainable, right? If it's like only me creating it. And luckily, we have this amazing community online of all of these resources and tasks that are out to kind of at least cut down or at least give you a really good start on where you might go with that. So that's pretty awesome. So it sounds like you were kind of addicted like us in terms of when you see the light in, if it's that one student's eye, like that one girl that you were referencing where really tough to engage early on, weren't too sure, like, how am I going to, first of all, make a connection, help this student to like want to learn this stuff? Because let's be honest, some people say we've got to make the math something that kids can use in their everyday life. And I'm going to argue that that's not really what kids are striving for. Like, they're not like, well, I want this so it'll help me, 10 years from now. They want thought-provoking questions, and they want curiosity, and they want something that just draws them in. And it sounds like you were able to do that. So now I'm wondering, could we flip things a little bit and start chatting a little bit more about where are some parts of that? So it sounds like you had a great start. Were there any sort of like road bumps along the way that you wouldn't mind? I see you shaking your head. Yes, which, we all had those, right? I'm wondering, can you like help highlight maybe some of those pieces? And obviously you're more than welcome to talk about other successes as well. We want this to be super asset based, but then we also want to look at like, so where are those road bumps? And, people listening at home, I'm sure, are going to be able to relate to them, just like John and I will. So where are those struggles where are we getting pitched up on?
I think I can keep this asset based as well, even though there are struggles. It's a lot of the stuff you guys talked about. I had several main concerns that you talked a lot about, is that while that one student like wouldn't leave for lunch, I had another student who was the student that typically came into class, paid attention, figured out the procedures, solved the problems. And this student had a meltdown. Like, I gave that same task and they didn't know what to do. And they just had this meltdown. And I didn't have any guidance to know, like, what do I do about that? And I didn't know anything about grouping strategies, vertical non-permanent services, visibly random grouping, any of that. So I was just having him work alone. And, I'd read somewhere that you're supposed to ask questions and not just give kids the answers. And so I just kind of like mumbled something and moved on. And I totally didn't help with that at all. And I'm going to make this asset based. And I guess this is going to apply to everything. It was actually in November. I had just gotten out of the hospital from the transplant. And I was like, oh man, I'm going to have to get back into the classroom. Like, I got to figure some of this stuff out. And just that day, I think it was John on his blog posted the how to change a textbook problem to make a math moment that matters. And I read that and I was like, this is me. This is it. This is it. Like, this is what I need. And with all the different links, it linked to the 3-act task. I think it's on Tap Into Teen Minds, where it talks about how you guys struggled at first with making a lot of those connections. Like, oh, these guys know what I'm talking about. Like, these guys are going to address the issues that I was struggling most. And so, like, this idea of how to help kids and how to question, when you referred to the 5 practices, I like started reading that. I'm like, yeah, bingo. This would have helped so much. Like, if I'd known, I didn't have an objective. I just kind of started the task. I'm like, well, this will be kind of good to kind of maybe bring out this idea or that, but I didn't have an objective. I had no idea how to consolidate. I didn't do the problem ahead of time. I was like, oh, this will be cool. This is how I did it. So I'm walking around and kids are doing some stuff.
Yeah, you're like, I know the formula, right? Like, I'm like, I got this. I can get an answer.
And some kids like got right to the formula. Some kids were doing something. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting what you're doing. But like, I hadn't pre-planned any of it. I hadn't anticipated what they were going to do. And I certainly didn't do anything with that consolidation piece where it was like, okay, we're now going to present. So I just left it, the bell rang and we leave. And it's like, well, did anybody learn anything? So that was something you guys have helped me with immensely in the resources that you've shared. And that kind of also gets to the other thing, like this idea of there's this rigorous math content. I'm in a district, we've got math we've got to teach. And they say, hey, what are you teaching? How do you know you're teaching it? How are you getting to it? And there was no guidance until I stumbled upon your blogs and stuff about, well, how do you teach through task to teach the math? Like, it's super engaging, it's super cool, but how do you actually push that thinking forward? And I guess that's like the last thing. It's like that guidance on how to teach the curriculum. It's like, okay, well, I've got this cool task and I've kind of inserted it because it's cool, but I don't know what exactly to do like long term and how that all fits. And I recently took the Make Math Moments That Matter workshop, and you guys talked a lot about the progressions, the learning progressions. I'm like, oh, that's how you do it. And like, I always struggled with the task. It's like, well, what happens when the kid finishes super early and you've got one kid that they're just making, that one group that's just starting to kind of make it through. And it's like, oh yeah, well, if you know the progression, you can have it prepared. Like, yeah, they're doing some sort of linear equation problems. Like, throw a system at them. It's like, now I've got like this plan, like, oh, I know where I'm going. So I can kind of push the kids that can that way while I help other kids that are struggling a little bit more.
I'm so happy that you shared some of that background piece of the struggles, because again, the reason we shared those resources and those tools and the reason why we set things up in the online workshop in the way we have is exactly like you said. Like, we were those eager guys that were like, boom, we found the solution to making kids not hate math class so much. And we always do the caveat, because it's like, we're not saying that it's going to make every single student suddenly be like, oh, like everything's perfect, but to just see that change in students leaning in and just noticing kids when the bell would go and they'd say like, wow, that was quick. Like, that was a huge compliment to me. Like, I didn't need them to say this was my favorite class, but for them to not have already been like having their books packed up, ready to go 5 minutes ahead of time. Like, to me, that was like a huge step in the right direction. But like you said, we sort of walked out and went, I mean, I know they're engaged, but I don't know who knows what, and a good colleague of mine, good friend of mine, Yvette Lehman, always says, like, I don't know who heard what, and I don't know what this means to them. And I didn't know where to send them next, so I'm so happy that you hit on this idea of the progression. And for those listening who might not be super confident in that area of like the progression of how different concepts sort of build on one another, that's okay. Like, it's just this idea that if you know it exists, and like people have different perspectives as well on how it works, it's just knowing it's there and then trying to dig deeper. And like, I think we'll forever be learning more and more about those nuances in between, but it's just about getting started, which is awesome. So it sounds like you had found some resources, and it sounds like those sort of helped you, give you something to like bite into. So how are you feeling in that regard when you think about how to, like, you talked about a lot of things there, right? Like, you talked about the 5 practices, which is a book we talk about all the time and is a super easy read, which is great. So like, someone like yourself just went and grabbed it and it probably blew your mind, right? When you go like, oh, it seems so obvious after. You're like, how didn't I know that? But I never realized it. I never put it together. And, you're talking about some of those other pieces like progression. So how do you feel with how that's sort of developing in your classroom? Maybe just give us like an update on what that might look like or sound like in your class, or at least in what you hope to do in your class when you get back to business in August.
Yeah. So part of my role as a TOSA, one of the things that I was doing was working on writing some sort of accommodations. I was using, are you familiar with illustrative mathematics, the 6 through 8 curriculum? So I was kind of accommodating some of those resources for our special education RSP teachers. And I ended up using a lot of those. Now, I couldn't like give a 3-act task because I feel like you do need to know a lot about 3-act tasks, but I implemented a lot of those ideas just into the progression of the lessons. And that's how I kind of accommodated them. I've heard a lot through your blog about, or your podcast about lowering the threshold and raising the ceiling. It was always like, oh, great. Yeah, I want to lower that threshold, but how do I do it? And how do I increase that engagement? And speaking of like those mind-blowing moments, your curiosity path was like for sure the most mind-blowing moment, I think, in my career. Like if I could tell somebody one thing, especially working with English language learners and special education students, so many of them see those numbers or they see that context and they're like, oh, I can't do this. There's somebody else is going to do it. And I'll just copy off them. This idea of making it visual, withholding information. I just started incorporating that into lessons. And I would kind of like write some directions to the teachers of how they might go ahead and do that, having them notice and wonder, and then estimate and anticipate some of those ideas. So as I plan on going back to the classroom, I'm feeling pretty comfortable with a lot of that. Granted, I'm also feeling comfortable knowing that it's probably going to be a disaster some days as I try to implement teaching methods that students probably, I'm assuming, haven't been exposed to before. But I think it will really help, especially since I'm going to be teaching 3 course 1 courses for English language learners. So that's like a mix of like beginning algebra and geometry. And I'm expected to teach the same exact content as everyone else to some kids who, my wife is actually the ELD 1 teacher, and I went and met some of my students I'm going to have next year, and they're at the Hi, My Name Is stage. So it's like, how do we get them involved in the task? And I think like that sparking curiosity, withholding some stuff, making it visual, providing the language supports around that and that structure will really help get kids thinking about the context, understanding the problem. So it's not so overwhelming for them. And then, they can use those visuals. And again, and I keep referring back to this, but in the workshop, you talk be more like Prince, the concrete, representational, abstract model, like that idea of making it visual and having them understand some of those ideas and have an idea of what they're doing before they start engaging with the math might be really helpful. So I'm feeling really confident with that, probably more confident than I should be, but
well, I just want to comment and say, just based on what you've said, first of all, I'm looking at John right now as well, and I can see it in his eyes. We feel so happy to hear that you took that content. It's so easy to sign up for something, go in, and it's we all have lives, life is busy and you have things going on. It's really easy to go wow, I really want to learn. I really want to do these things. But just in hearing what you're saying and the fact that you've been out of the classroom through your recovery and then getting ready for the classroom coming up after summer in August, and how you're speaking to these points so fluidly really tells me that you've done a huge amount of reflection. And I think also just for you to be aware, or at least conscious of this idea that, okay, I think it all makes sense, but we know how that goes, right? I think I have it all worked out every day that I present a workshop or every time I go into a classroom. And every single day I walk out of there and I go, wow, there was always 3 or 4 things. And I'm was not ready for that. And in many ways, it's you can't always be ready. But the fact that you're aware, your awareness is so high. And I just want to tip my cap a little bit to just the fact that you've done that thinking, you've done a ton of learning clearly. And I think that's going to put you in such a great position so that when that curveball does come, because it's going to, you don't know what pitch it's going to be, but it's coming. It's at least you can be ready. And sometimes, it's going to buckle you at the knees and you're just going to go that one got me, but you can feel good about the fact that you've done so much work ahead of time that I feel you'll be able to get that next pitch. So, I didn't want to interrupt, but I do want to make sure that you have that feather in your cap, because clearly you've done a lot of serious thinking here.
Yeah. And one thing I'd like to say too, and I talked to my colleagues a little bit about this, I got 2 of them to do the workshop with me. So we form a little study group every week and we meet and talk about the videos. I feel the more I do it, the more I see how it's done, right? I was tutoring the son of a cousin the other day in geometry, and I was looking, he was doing 2-column proofs. It's not the most engaging topic. And I was looking at it and I'm how would I use the curiosity path here? And I started seeing it had this little visual, and it was this simple little proof, but I had this visual and I was oh, I'd use Keynote and I'd make it visual and I'd have this piece moving back and forth and I'd do a notice and wonder and value that student voice. And you start seeing these things. And
do you feel when you do some of that work, for me, I feel it's you can almost see inside the kid's brain in a way, like, when you ask them and you just really listen. And the hardest part, I think, is the listening. Like, it's so easy to miss or not to ask the right question. There's tons of times, like after a class, I'll come out and I'm like, I should ask this because I still didn't get what I was hoping to. But like when you anticipate something and it does work out, there's nothing better. There's not a better feeling in the world when you're like, holy smokes, that actually worked. Like you start to feel like you're getting into some of their heads. And then when it doesn't, that's when you go, oh man, like I have no idea where that came from, but I'm going to have to think more about that. Super cool.
Yeah, I haven't said much in the last few minutes. And the reason is I've been hung up, Michael, on one of the first questions you said. I would love to go back to this. When you said you had that student that wouldn't leave the class, but then you had that high flyer student that was just in, like, I don't know if anyone else is listening right now and still wants to know how we'd handle that. Like that kid who's like, I'm really great. I've been successful in math. And all of a sudden, what are you doing to me? And I'm really frustrated right now. And you said at that time, you didn't know what to do. And I'm wondering now that after you've gone through some learning, you've had a little bit more thought and reflection, what would you say to this student? It's been on my mind since you said it. So I would love for us to just chat a little bit about that. And then we'll dive into some questions that you have and struggles that you have for ongoing stuff. But I'd love to get your take on what you would do or say to this student now.
Yeah, and I do want to be cognizant of your time as well, because once I get talking, I can
no worries.
Talk. Okay, because I didn't know if you're 3 hours ahead of me, and I'm on summer break.
No worries.
Man, I love that question because you're putting me on the spot so much. I would like to think, so I'm going to break this down into two parts, and I'm thinking on my feet here. I would like to think that knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have that kid there, right? Like I wouldn't have a kid that didn't have a strategy. One, because he wouldn't be working alone. First of all, I would definitely have him working in some sort of group. I've already bought the white books that you guys recommended. So I got them prepared, figuring out where I'm going to put them in my class. So I'd have them work in groups. And I really like this part of the curiosity path where you have kids anticipate, that question of like, what information would you want to know and why? And getting kids to think about a strategy before they start. And I would like to think that that would support those kids a little bit more so that when they're sitting there and they're kind of stuck, they wouldn't be because they have an idea of what they're going to do. Another thing, I don't know if you've talked about this on your podcast, but I've recently read a book that was almost as mind-blowing to me as the Curiosity Path, but I'm going to put the Curiosity Path at number one. It was Routines for Reasoning.
Okay, that's actually on my radar. I haven't read it yet, but it is actually on a list right now for me.
So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of briefly paraphrase what that book's about.
Sure.
And I don't have it with me, and I forget the author's names, and I want to plug them.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. What it does is it looks at the ways in which mathematicians think. And it does that from, I don't know if you guys use the mathematical practices. You talk about the process standards.
Yeah, we have similar ones.
Okay.
Yeah, they're called processes, but same idea.
Yeah. Okay. So this book starts with mathematical practice number one, right? The perseverance, solving problems and making sense of them. And then it talks about practices 2, 7, and 8, which are about quantitative reasoning, structural reasoning, and reasoning through repetition. And it goes through and provides routines that kids can go through with questions they can ask themselves and strategies they can use. So their quantitative reasoning is you look for the quantities, right? The quantities being a number, a value, and a label, but that value could be unknown. So it could be a variable. And then you look at the relationships between them. So a number could be a quantity or it could be a relationship, but you figure out what those are, you figure out what the relationships are, and then you draw a picture that represents it. And by drawing the picture and making it visual, it might give you some sort of insight into the problem. So when I think about that kid that doesn't have a strategy or doesn't know what to do, one of the things I'm planning for my course 1 class next year, I've actually made them objectives, are the mathematical practices where I want kids to reason quantitatively, and I'm going to explicitly teach them through these routines how to do that. So if I did get to a point where a student might struggle with that, I would hope that we'd worked on some of these strategies by then, because I'm planning on baking it into the class, and to say, all right, well, if you're not quite sure what to do, what's a question you could ask yourself? Like, what's a way you could reason quantitatively or structurally, noticing, like, have I solved a problem like this before? Or if you've made a table, how are you calculating the values in the table where you're not just like using it to guess and check, but you're using it to develop a process and then kind of generalize that process so you can come up with a formula or a rule or something, that I would still be able to ask the question, but I'd be able to ask it in a way to talk about a strategy that they can use to help solve that problem.
Right.
Yeah, that's
right.
I mean, this all sounds great in my head. We'll see how it works.
No, these are great tips for sure.
Awesome.
Like, they are good actionable tips for people to think about. Like, how can I help those students? That's a common thing. You deal with that on an everyday basis. There's always kids that are going to struggle. Even when you lower the floor very low, there's going to be parts when that floor starts to rise. Everyone hits that kind of frustration level. Well, not everyone, but a lot of kids hit that frustration level depending on the grade level or in the skill level the kids have. But these are great tips to have and that you've given us to think about from that book.
I really like how you frame that, where you were saying, like, it's like, hopefully students aren't in that position because you're sort of creating that classroom culture in your approach. And I really think too, you mentioned it earlier, let's idea of low floor, high ceiling. By lowering the floor, and especially doing it early on, like when we do this first week of school, like you folks going back in early August and kids are back in the classroom, and you really try to like focus less on curriculum and more on the math practices early on in the course, I think really can help students sort of defeat that idea. If I start doing this stuff in the middle of a year, then I might, like a student, especially my like high flyers, right? Like they've got the game of math figured out, and it's like, I don't know how this game works. And, you know, all of those things are going on. So it sounds like from what you're saying, I think I would agree with you. Like hopefully building that culture early on, students will, if you do have any issues, it's like the stakes are still really low because it's like the beginning of the school year. It's not like exams are coming up or, you know, midterms are coming up or whatever it is. It's like right away, right out of the gate, you know, here's the rules in this class. And, you know, we're going to do things maybe a little bit differently than how maybe things were done in some of your other classes.
Let's probe a little more, Michael. What's on your mind lately? Like, what challenges are you experiencing that you want to chat with us about?
Yeah, this is probably like what I really want to get into and really want to talk to you about. So as I said, I'm going to be teaching course 1 for sheltered students, where some of them are going to have some pretty good basic interpersonal communication skills. The academic language might be a little bit harder, and some of them are going to show up 4, 5, 6, 7 months into the school year, speaking no English, and they'll show up and say, hey, I'm here to learn math. And I'm responsible for teaching them that. And I had never, before the Make Math Moments That Matter workshop, I had never before heard of spiraling. And it was like the last one to be released. And I saw this word spiraling. And I just, as the weeks were going on, I'm like, what's that about? What's that about? I want to know what that's about, you know? And I finally got to it. And I was like, why don't we all do this? Right? I don't understand why.
On paper, right?
like this makes so much sense. And I'd actually been exposed to a curriculum that did it. It was CPM. I don't know if you're familiar with CPM.
Oh, yeah.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
But, you know, I didn't know what they were doing. I just knew that they bounced back and forth. And I was looking at that and saying, you know, not only do I think this would be really good for the reasons that you've said, you know, some of the ideas that it causes students to have to remember what they're doing. It gives them more opportunities to access the material. It keeps them from getting bored because it's not like, hey, we're doing unit 3 on this topic and we're going to do that for the next 4 weeks. And, you know, how are you going to introduce a task and surprise them when they know what it's about? But also the challenge that I'm worried about the most is that, like, my wife will get new students in March, you know, and we finish in May. And so if we've already taught, we're just in the geometry part and we've already taught all the algebra, well, how am I serving that kid if I don't go back and do some of that? So when I saw this concept of spiraling, I'm like, I'm doing that, but it's a little bit difficult. To do. And
do you mind telling us a little bit more of like what I tend to agree with you that, you know, it is a challenging thing.
It's a big change. It's a big change.
So what about it is sort of like feeling kind of like a big thing here?
Okay.
Sorry to cut you off. Maybe just in your own words, explain what you think it is for people who are also just hearing it for the first time right now.
Yeah, that's actually
what I think spiraling is, or my process.
Spiraling.
So spiraling is when, like, normally as math teachers, if you look at a textbook, you've got chapters. So in my school's textbook, we've got, you know, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And every chapter covers a different topic. It cycles through. So even though we're like a course 1 integrated school, or on an integrated pathway, we still teach it like, oh, well, the first semester is algebra and the second semester is geometry. So we're not actually integrating any of the ideas. And the idea of spiraling, and I'm just regurgitating what you guys have said. So if I say something wrong, feel free to correct me. But the idea is that you break it down into chunks. And so you might spend like 3 days on an algebraic topic, and then you might spend 3 days on a geometry topic. And if there's any ways to connect them, like that's great because you're now kind of doing these things together. And then you might go to statistics or whatever. And then you might come back to algebra and do that again. So you're spending several days on that. And every time you do that, you go a little bit deeper. So the first time, like, and I'll just, because I've been doing it with course 1, and these are some things I have questions about as well. But in my mind, like the first time you do that, you're going to present students with a problem where they have to write a linear expression in one variable. The second time, you might have them write a linear expression in one variable that maybe is kind of set up in such a way where you could use a distributive property to simplify it. And so every time you go through it, it's the same concept, but they're just going a little bit deeper. So they have to remember, students will have to remember and recall what they've learned, but then you're just taking it to that next step. You know, the benefits to that, which I've kind of touched on a little bit and you've touched on a lot, is that one, it forces students to kind of remember. I know that my students have always really struggled with retention. So something I taught, 6 weeks before, you provide them a problem on a standardized test or a benchmark assessment, and they're like, I don't remember doing this because we just taught it once. That idea that teaching by units gives us a false sense of mastery where, hey, they did this test really well, so now they know it. Well, it's like, how do you know unless they can do it again in 6 weeks? And so forcing them to recall it helps with that. There's also the idea of boredom, right? Like, it's coming. And I've had the experience where I've gotten into a topic and like students are really struggling with it and they just know for the next 2 weeks, math class is going to suck because they hate this particular topic or they really struggle with it. And, that's what we're doing for the next 2 weeks. And, if I feel it's important, we're going to be doing it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks and like moving things along, and it just like mires everything down. It also ruins if you teach by chapters, it ruins the surprise in the same way, especially if you're trying to teach through tasks. It's like, hey, here's this interesting task. What do you notice and wonder? Well, we're doing linear relations right now. So he's going to want me to say something about linear relations. So let me figure something like that. There's no surprise. There's no mystery there. I mean, all these are reasons why I'm like, I have to do this.
I love how you described it. I feel like you've done a really good job of summarizing. And I'm going to back up to even your example, because your example was, and you were very explicit about it, just an example of like, because you said maybe 3 days of this and maybe 3 days of that. And one of the biggest things that people ask us is like, how many days, should you spend on something? And the big answer is it depends. So like it could be 3, it could be 5, so that's just more or less for anyone who's listening or watching this, just to make sure that they know that, okay, well, there's no one right way to do it, but how you've sort of framed that out, I think is very clear. And I also think too, even just this idea of coming back to these ideas and going deeper with them, it just forces you, and you hit on it, this idea that it's forcing you to kind of go back and really utilize and sort of push your brain to put things into long-term memory versus it just being like really fresh, right? And just getting that illusion that it when really it's just familiar because it's from, the past little while.
Right.
Yeah.
Super cool. And now that you've shared that, we're wondering, as you do this, so there's a lot to that clearly, like based on what you've said, where are some areas that you're particularly seeing as little hurdles here that maybe we can hash out, and we'll keep on sort of probing a little bit to try to get deeper and deeper and really see.
Yeah. Is it okay if I give you kind of like my general process? Because I mean, you guys have done this and I don't know if my general process is just completely not going to work. Yeah. So I actually was fortunate enough to be on my district scope and sequence team this school year. So I was part of figuring out like what are the essential topics and standards that we want to cover. And so I took that and I kind of used that to organize by like the topics and the big ideas. Just for some reference, you've interviewed Jo Boaler before with the mathematical mindsets, and she talks a lot, and I'm plugging everybody here. She talks a lot in her book, Mathematical Mindsets, about how you need to value in your assessment practices what you value. Otherwise, the kids won't value it, right? Like you need to make it worth something. So I organize by the topics and the big ideas. And so my first objective is, and I've got a rubric for it, I can work collaboratively with others. And then the next three are pretty much straight out of that Routines for Reasoning book, where, I can reason, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but I can reason quantitatively, I can reason with structure and use structure to solve problems, and I can reason through repetition. And then I get into the content standards. And so what I was trying to do, because I've never really done this before, but I'm planning on doing some standards-based grading, really just doing standards-based grading. So I didn't want to have like 100 objectives that I was grading kids on. I was thinking of having like a main concept idea. So just as people are listening, if they're not looking at it, one of my topics is algebra single variable. And the objective is I can write expressions and equations in one variable and use them to solve problems, right? So you've got all sorts of different topics within that.
Right.
You've got simple single variable problems. You've got the distributive property. You've got equations with variables on both sides. You have all these different levels of complexity. And my idea is as I spiral deeper into these topics and they meet some of these sub-objectives, they're gaining credit towards having mastery on this overall like larger objective. So that way I'm really only grading them on these like 13 objectives. So I kind of organize it by that. And I wrote a bunch of I can statements, and then I listened to one of your recent podcasts where I'd never heard of the know, understand, do, the KUD model before. I'm like, perfect. And so I quickly went through and started. It's quite fun to do, actually, to figure out, well, where's the understanding? What do they just have to know? And what are the skills? And I thought it was important. At first, I was just going to say, I'll do that next year or whatever. But I was looking at that and thinking that might really help me break it down. And that will lead to one of my questions as well with spiraling. But like, this will help me break it down and figure it out. And then my plan is to kind of go through and search for, before I even break anything down, search for tasks. And I feel like this is going to be the meat of it, and I've got a list. If you look at it, I think it's on page 3 of 3-act math resources and inquiry tasks and other task resources. So I'm planning on looking at your websites, the 3-act math tasks, the task search, John Rowe. I think you guys are familiar with him on Twitter. He's got this
We're actually going to be chatting with him this weekend, I think. He's going on the podcast
from Australia.
He's been really inspirational as well. Yeah. I've got the Mathematics Assessment Project, Illustrated Mathematics, and Rich. And I'm just going to go through and start looking at tasks and figuring out, well, what are like the main ideas and concepts that come out of these tasks and where do they fit?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in here because, that's exactly when Kyle and I began this process the first time. You've done way more thinking about it than we have. And
we just rolled up the sleeves and went.
Yeah,
we just try this.
That's patently not true because you guys didn't have you guys. So I was able to take a lot of those ideas. It's pushed me.
So what we did is what you just mentioned is we taught through task first. I've said this before. I quote my our good friend Al Overwick, who was also, we learned from, he was just spiraling way before us, teacher from Ottawa, Ontario. He's always said, teach through the task first and uncover the curriculum instead of like cover curriculum. So he was always a proponent of find a great task that you can bring out the math that you want to talk about. So, that's how we started with our courses. It's like, what are the tasks that we can then bring? Like if we want to do, what you said, solving equations or using algebra to work with equations, what is a task that we can use to bring that idea forward? And then we can focus on that idea. So that's what we did. We just went through tasks and then we consolidated together on those tasks on which, Kyle, what tasks are you doing for that expectation? What task am I doing? And we made a big list of that. And that's how we started to begin. And then everything else kind of, we learned along the way, but you're starting way farther than we did, but you're also starting to think about tasks. Yeah.
I've participated in a lot of your stuff and I'm very grateful for the work that you guys have done just in general. Like you've led me to all these different areas and ideas and it makes these things not seem so intimidating.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, that, and that's, totally. And that's the intent, right? Is I'm not even saying maybe there were people out there, we just didn't know where to find them, right? So, we had Dan Meyer and we had access to a bunch of amazing tasks, which without that, we would probably just be slugging away, doing it the same way we were doing it for so long. So let's dig a little deeper. What else? What else is, you're seeing at that hurdle? I love this idea of like starting tasks and like kind of using that to kind of form like how this might be organized. what do you see as you're picturing that? What do you see as like something that might be a bit of a challenge for you?
I got several. So as I've gone through and done this, like these questions are just popping up. So one of them that I've thought about a lot is like, okay, I've got these like really 9 different things that I'll be spiraling. And then, the collaboration and the reasoning skills I'll kind of be insert. So my general plan, just to give some perspective of how I plan to do this, is the first 4, which is the collaboration and the reasoning skills, I'm planning on just like kind of interspersing throughout. So none of those will get their own chunk. It'll be like, okay, we're dealing with this objective 5 or whatever, and I want to focus on quantitative reasoning. So I'm going to go through that routine with some sort of problem involving objective 5. And so as I think about going through and doing this, it's like one of the questions that comes up, well, I still have, 9 objectives. So if I hit one, like, how long do I wait? Like, do I go through all 9 and then come back maybe a month later? That seems a little excessive. It's like, what would be your recommendation for how long you wait before you return to go deeper into a single progression?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways you can look at this. And it's also a couple ways you can organize your content and what you're going to talk about. Like I've heard it done a few different ways. One way, and the first way we did it is not something that I'd recommend, but all we did was load our tasks. We always say this, Kyle, we loaded our tasks in a shotgun and then we just shot it at the year. And we'd spend a day or 2 on this one and then we just switch gears and we had no rhyme or reason to switch to another one. It was like when that task was done and we focused on 1 learning goal or 2 learning goals for that task. When that was done, we just grabbed the next one that was in the line and the line was random almost. And we did the next one, which was another learning goal. So I think you can be more organized. It sounds like you were working to be more organized than we were.
John, can I interrupt you there?
Yeah, sure.
And just, I noticed for my class, and I think you'd agree, but feel free if I'm off, while we didn't have that intentionality, and John sort of hitting on this idea of like looking back on it, it would have been way better had we had more intentionality behind why we put certain tasks in certain spots. The one thing that might be a bit disappointing for ourselves to reflect on is the idea that it's not like student achievement went down either. So I'm like, if we did this with no intention, and actually student engagement was higher, but student achievement wasn't affected, that's kind of sad to me, because I'm like, if we just randomly did it and there was no rhyme or reason to it, and we got essentially the same outcomes we typically get when we did it in units, that makes me sort of believe that, oh my gosh, how many years were we doing units where I thought I was being intentional, but clearly it wasn't having a lasting effect, right? Like that retention. So sorry, John, I just want to make that clear. It wasn't like it was a disaster happening that way. It's just no. So much better.
Yeah, it wasn't a disaster, because I think one thing that was a really good benefit of that is because people would say, like, are your kids learning the math better this way? And at that time, we could say, like you just said, it's like they're more engaged. But I always would say that my students were better problem solvers after. And I think it was to the effect that, like what you said, Michael, is that are we really problem solving if in the 2-week span we're on linear relations, every kid knows that the next day's the problem's going to be about linear relations. So when we scattered the problems and we taught through problems, they didn't know what to use to solve this problem. They had to think back in the brain, like, where does this relate to what I've learned in the past, and bring it forward, which strengthens your brain. And our students became, in my opinion, more confident problem solvers because of that. It was like they always saw unfamiliar problems to start class, and then we brought the math forward. And since they did that on a regular basis, when you handed them the problem at any time and it was unfamiliar, they didn't have like the whole drop pen, like throw your hands up. I don't know. You didn't show me how to solve this. Like that just didn't happen anymore. So that was a really good benefit of us just kind of scattering problems. I'm just going to give you one more that I've heard and I've used in a different course, was that you can also look at your content or your expectations and think about what are the big ideas, but also think of it this way. Mary Barassa, also from Ottawa, also an early adopter of spiraling, spiraled her course by looking at like doing everything. Her first kind of wave was everything graphically, visually. She solved systems of equations graphically and visually with counters and manipulatives. she was factoring expressions that way with manipulatives, and all the linear stuff in that course was graphs first, and quadratics was graphs first. And then it was like the next spiral was starting to link the graphing work that you've done in all these different areas to the abstract. And much like what you learned with the concrete fading model, it was like everything was concrete. And then we spiraled it down to be more abstract, and then finally end up with tougher problems that were very abstract, very algebraic by the end. So you can think of it that way too. And then every big unit topic kind of goes along that pathway. So to answer, like we'll always say, I guess, to answer your question about like how long do you spend, it does depend. And it also depends on the kids, right? Like it depends on whether the kids are ready to move on. Like when you taught through that task and brought the math out forward and then practice that learning goal that you're wanting to bring out, how are they doing on that? Are they ready to move on to the next one? And sometimes it's like, maybe they're not ready, but that's okay. You're going to hit it back later. So I think usually what I would do is think, how long does it take to get that task and that learning goal feeling somewhat confident for your students before you move on?
Okay. And so I'm kind of inferring from that as well that maybe, because one of the things I thought about is like, what if students are particularly struggling with a task? And I've noticed sometimes students that struggle, they're like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And so one of the things I'm hearing a lot is like, have that flexibility to say, hey, maybe I planned to come back to this in like 3 weeks, but they didn't really get it. And they need to move on right now where they're at. Like they just can't do this anymore. So I'm going to go into the next chunk and then maybe rearrange it. So I come back to it in a week, right?
Yeah,
maybe hit it from a different angle.
I love that idea. Like that's one option. The other option too is like trying to be responsive to the student learning needs in the class and thinking, okay, well, if they're not getting it, right? Like, and when we say getting it, we're talking, like students in general is just not sort of catching on. Clearly there's something missing here. Sometimes giving yourself that time can be nice for you to now reflect on it and say, okay, well, when I come back to this, I don't want to wait until, I say I'm coming back in a week and not think about it until the day before. Between now and then, you're kind of going, okay, well, like, what is it that students are actually struggling with this topic? And sometimes what we find, and if we dig a little deeper, like what I pick to pivot to, we call it pivoting or proceeding, right? So I have this plan and maybe I have to like pivot the plan because I'm going to do something tomorrow that might not directly fix or take care of the current misconception or issue or challenge. But by doing that, it's something that I know is like before this thing that students are struggling with. Like, so is it possible, can I possibly set up some sort of structure in my class where I could give purposeful practice for students to work on and I can pull small groups and try to learn more about what they're struggling with? So actually like work with 4 or 5 kids just individually and say, hey, we're struggling with this. I'm wondering, is it because of that? What's that concept before it that might actually be the thing hindering it? So for example, if I'm working with a student and they're struggling with division, right? A certain type of division, maybe quotative division. And if I just sort of keep hammering division, but what I realize if I back up a little bit is they're actually really struggling with this idea of skip counting and skip counting backwards in particular. Well, if they're approaching division as repeated subtraction, that ability to kind of fluidly do that and fluently do that could be the thing that's sort of holding them up here. It might not be that they don't get the idea of division itself. They just might not have the flexibility, the number flexibility to do it. So depending what that topic is, like maybe what you do tomorrow might be a concept, like maybe it's going back to something from earlier in the year, even though I meant I was going to spiral back to this in a few weeks. Maybe it's time for me to go back to that place because maybe that concept itself is the thing that could push them over that little hurdle.
Right. Can I actually ask a follow-up question to that?
Absolutely.
Because you used a word that I've seen a ton, and I've actually used it myself, and I have like a concept of what it is, but I've never actually seen it defined. And I think a lot of what you just said hinges on it as well, like saying that you're going to have kids do purposeful practice. What do you mean by purposeful practice?
Yeah, like purposeful practice, it's not like one specific thing, but it's like picking those practice problems with more intentionality than what I used to do, which was like, this is the worksheet that I've always used, and I'm just going to go ahead and hand that over. Or sometimes what I used to do was like, I had the worksheet or I had the textbook and I was like, the homework questions I give out every single year are 1ACE, 2BD. This one's like A to D, but every class has a different group of students in front of me. So it's like me actually looking at that and going, okay, wait a second, what do these students actually need? And a good place to start could be this idea of, as a whole group, what does this whole group need? Like maybe 1 and 2 aren't helpful or necessary at all. Maybe that later question is actually like way beyond what students are ready for. And I can see that right now just through my formative assessment, right? My observations and my conversations. So rather than being married to this idea that every year, like I think as teachers, we get so married to our plan because last year kids did, we're going to call it okay. And if I modify anything, will that be the thing that like the straw that breaks the camel's back? So it's like, we don't like to change those types of things, right? We're like, well, I gave this much practice every single day and things turned out this way. If I take away some of those problems or if I change some of those problems, is that going to help or hurt? And I'm going to argue that if I'm paying attention, it will actually help, right? Like if I'm going to pick purposefully the practice problems I pick, they don't have to be like, the reason I'm using the example of a handout or textbook is because the one thing we don't want people to walk away from when they listen to the podcast or when they come into the workshop, the online workshop, we don't want people to think that any type of practice is bad or that worksheets themselves are bad. Like, I just think the way we used worksheets and sometimes even the way we've used textbooks in the past was without purpose. And that is the part that we don't want. Like, we want to use those things for there's lots of good stuff in textbooks. There's even like really cool explorations. I just used to always skip them because I didn't actually teach with intention and I didn't realize what I was missing and the decisions I was making. So that's mine. John, like anything else miss?
Yeah, for sure. I think another example of purposeful practice, and usually this is the one that pops into my mind when I think of it, is like practice that's embedded in the task itself. So for example, if you've ever heard of open middle from Robert Kaplinski and others, like he's got, you throw up an open middle problem where there's a whole bunch of blanks in this kind of solving equations thing, this prompt, and you got to put in the numbers to say, make the smallest solution. Think about how much practice is going on in that problem itself just to tackle that one task. Kids are putting numbers in. They have to solve that equation. Did they get a low number? I don't know. I won't know until I do it again. And then again and again, and then they compare to their classmates. So that's one of my go-tos to explain purposeful practice, because you're practicing in that activity purposefully to solve this other thing. Another one is like if you've used Dan Meyer's Dandy Candies task, which is on surface area, volume of different shapes, like what's maximizing the volume given a certain amount of surface area. So there's different shapes on the screen. You have to find the volume of each of them. In order to figure this problem out, which is bigger than just doing that, you have to calculate the volume of various shapes and you have to calculate the surface area of various shapes, which is practice built into this other big idea. So that's another example, in addition to what Kyle said, is what purposeful practice could be.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, because I was thinking more along John's line of thinking, right? It was like, instead of just giving them a page of 40 problems, it's like they need to use what they've learned in a context that is like they're kind of like taking it almost a step further, or like applying it to a different context in a similar way. But it's not just like we're just going to do this procedure. But I really like that idea of thinking about the student needs, right? Like this intentionality being like what's going to be best for the student, not necessarily just this, hey, this one problem is going to be great. And thinking about that and also saying, well, which kids is it going to be better for? How can I tweak it? Being intentional, thinking about what your kids need. I like that idea a lot.
I was going to say, when you are using a task, like you can actually build out some of those problems, like as call it like extensions. Dan Meyer calls it sequels sometimes. Usually his sequels are still kind of like media based in some way, but even incorporating the same context, because you work so hard to develop the context, that to have like a series of problems that sort of take that context, and it could even be a completely different scenario, but it's like if you're talking about this context, you can use something like it, where it's sort of like you can leapfrog from it. And someone who does that really well, I find, is Kathy Fosno in her Context for Learning kits. She doesn't like them being called kits. They're like units of study that she uses, and they're designed for elementary. So this probably not help for your specific scenario, but she does a great job of like setting the context, and then she rides that context sometimes for multiple days. And the context is just being modified a little bit. And what I find with those tasks is like you invest a lot into, I tend to do like a notice and wonder even with her resources when I'm in an elementary class, even though that's not necessarily the protocol that she suggests you use, but I do. And then the next day I can go into the next part of the task, and it's like we're into the task really quickly because we're using all of that curiosity that we built the previous day. Students feel really grounded in the context. It gives them a great leaping off point. So that's another great way to do it. Then also keep in mind too, you mentioned the word procedure, and I just want to, I guess, caution people listening that one of the effective teaching practices from Principles to Actions, which is a great book for anyone thinking about changing math practice in a system, in a school. It's by NCTM. And one of those math practices, or those effective teaching practices, I should say, is building procedural fluency from conceptual understanding. And I think early on in my journey, it was sort of like, I didn't mean to do this, but I think I almost turned down the idea of a procedure, like it's not allowed. But now what I realize is that the ultimate goal is that we build this conceptual understanding. We make sense of the math so that I can get to a place where I can use things with fluency, and I want to build the procedures, but I want to understand them. So that's key. And sometimes some of that practice might look like something that's more traditional. That's okay too. We just want to make sure kids are at this place where when they get that form of practice, like the practice I initially described, we don't want them feeling like, first of all, it's way too much and pointless. We don't want them to feel like it's not accessible to them. So if they have a conceptual understanding, then those types of problems to help them build that procedural fluency will develop over time, and it won't be as boring or overwhelming or inaccessible like it may have been in the past when I was in a classroom and some of my friends weren't able to do the homework because they just didn't have the conceptual understanding to get themselves out of a jam.
I like that for one of them is with English learners, particularly understanding the context can be one of the hardest things. Mm-hmm. Right? Like understanding the problem. So I like that idea with that practice or those extension questions using the same context because then they're there. Like, oh, okay, I understand this context. I don't have to work that out. I can focus more on the math. And the other part, and I think the reason why I tend to, I hear what you're saying, and I need to keep reminding myself, procedure isn't bad. I think I tend to make that connection though, because I know myself as a teacher, when teaching students that don't have fluency with the language, it's so easy to say, well, they struggle with the language, so I'm getting rid of all of it. And I'm just going to that procedure because if I do the procedure, the kids can kind of copy what I do and they can feel successful and I can feel successful. But in the long run, they're not learning anything. So to keep in my mind, with that purposeful practice, it can and should include some of that procedural ideas. But after that context and those concepts have been developed.
One of the goals is to try to get to that procedure. The procedures have been invented to make our life easier. And so if we can bring that to your kids' eyes to say, this procedure that we've now funneled ourselves into, we just do it together and it happens later. It would just make an eye open, they know exactly where the procedure comes from, which probably our parents and us never knew. But that would be the goal of my class is I do want to end up having those students leave my class with those same procedures. It's just how I develop them is different.
And I think it's you don't want to rush it. We talk about not rushing the algorithm in the workshop quite a bit. But then also the other piece is we don't want them to only walk away with procedure, right? And we don't want them to only walk away with conceptual understanding. When we look at the 5 proficiencies, which are outlined by the National Research Council and come up in the Adding It Up document or the Adding It Up book, chapter 4 is all about those 5 proficiencies. And 2 of those proficiencies, one is conceptual understanding, and then one of the others is procedural fluency. So it's this idea of it's not an either or game. We do want both, but the research does tell us that if we rush the procedure, then students tend to not want to know how it works because it's who would? If I know the shortcut, I'm going to do the shortcut. But it's like, then we miss all the math and all the math thinking. And then we also miss the opportunity to bail ourselves out when things are getting tough. So as the complexity of the tasks get more significant and things get harder, it's like, how do I break this task into something more manageable for myself if I don't understand how the procedure works in the first place? You can start going back to things like area of a trapezoid, right? Like for a lot of kids, that is a straight procedure because they never understood or never realized that, hey, that's just two triangles put together. Wait, I don't understand the area of a triangle formula, which is really just half of a rectangle, right? Like so when we go back and it's this conceptual idea that I do want to get to this place where it's like, I know and trust the formula for area of a trapezoid, but if for whatever reason I can't find, I can't remember this formula, it's like, well, wait a second, what is a trapezoid? All right, let's draw one. What other shapes? I know that the formula came from other shapes. What shapes can I break down here? Well, I could break it into two triangles, or I could break it into two triangles and a rectangle. Like if I know in my soul that conceptually this came from somewhere, then I can always figure it out. It might take me a little longer, but then it's like having that confidence. I don't have to give up because I forgot a formula because I had no understanding at all. So we want both of those things so that we can kind of have that efficiency over time. That's not the only goal. It's just one of the benefits of having this full sort of perspective when we talk about math proficiency. So I'm glad that you sort of referenced that, and I'm glad that you see some of that value as well. So that's great.
One of the things I've thought about in terms of tasks, I think back to like, I'd always get that question, like, when am I ever going to use this, Mr. Rubin? And I always went to that idea of like, well, how many of you play sports? Like, oh, who plays football? Like, do you lift weights? Like, are you lifting weights there? And I realized what I was asking didn't correlate with what I was doing in class. I was like saying, yeah, in math, you're learning how to problem solve. You're learning how to think. You're learning how to make connections, and you're growing your brain so that it becomes easier to make those connections, and you're learning patterns of thinking. Because ultimately what I've always kind of believed is that math was about problem solving and relationships and connections and observing patterns and figuring that out. But by teaching through procedure, I was the one doing all that work. Like I was the one making conceptual understanding and saying all that stuff. And then I'm like, okay, now you do the procedures, and like, you're going to learn by osmosis. So when you talk about like teaching through task, that's where it's like, I kind of think of this like dichotomy between teaching through task and procedural. And so it kind of puts that like negative light on the procedural, because to me, I associate that with like kind of being a liar to my students and saying, yeah, you're doing this because this is what math is, and not being authentic with that. And so I like the reminder that ultimately, like, yeah, you get to those procedures, but, and I know Kyle and John, you've talked about this with the difference between automaticity and memorization. Like this idea that if you do something enough conceptually, then you're going to start to understand how the pieces work, and you will do it more efficiently because that's a faster, the easier way to do it. And by teaching conceptually, we're teaching those relationships, because what's a concept other than a relationship between two different things, right? Two different quantities or two different ideas. That if we're teaching through tasks, they're getting to that procedure. But then when I tell them, hey, we're doing this to build your minds and to build your brains so that you can identify relationships and make connections and use them to solve problems, not necessarily even in math, but just in your own life, that we're going to come to the procedures. And I know those content skills are in the background, but I'm really being more authentic in what I'm telling them. And my actions and what I'm having them do in class matches up more.
And I think it's really important to show, and you mentioned Joe Bowler about really being clear on what we value. And if I'm sort of showing that I value the procedure more than, say, some other method, like modeling with area models or number lines, or like whatever strategy that the student uses, if it's like, I'm celebrating this procedure, like this student's arrived and these ones haven't, then obviously like I'm sort of perpetuating that idea. So it's this idea of like constantly having the conceptual there and the procedural, and helping students to kind of get there and asking them specific questions to help elicit that thinking and help them move there, but not like fixing them. Kathy Fosno says that all the time. Like, she doesn't want to fix the mathematician. She wants to use their thinking, and then wants to also like help them develop their thinking a little bit further through the questioning, right? Through that questioning and the conferring piece. So that for me is a huge piece. So it's getting late here. I think this is going to definitely have to be a multiple episode podcast. So John, what's our last question for this series of questions for our good friend Michael here? What should we end this on before we bring Michael back on for another episode?
Yeah, I think we should bring him back on because he's got a list of questions here that he wants answered. And I think we definitely want to answer them. And I think they would all benefit everyone listening. But Michael, we've had a good chat about various things this evening. And we are wondering, what is your, like, if you think back to all those, what's a big takeaway for you from this conversation? You've mentioned a few things about, the workshop and some of the learning you've done. Like, those were big takeaways then. But what's a big takeaway from this conversation here today?
Yeah, so I've got a couple. I think especially getting to that question of how long I should wait before I spiral back to a topic. Like, this idea of being flexible, I think, was my biggest takeaway. Like, as I plan, like, I should have a general idea, but know that, yeah, it's going to change. And I need to like think about where the kids are at, or if they've like really got something, then maybe you can take a little bit longer before returning to it. But, if they're struggling a little bit more with it, maybe you come back to it a little sooner, or you spend another day on it. That idea of pivoting instead of proceeding as planned. So that was definitely a big thing. And another, can I give 2 takeaways?
Sure.
So the second key takeaway I'd have is I really liked when Kyle was talking about purposeful practice, about picking problems with intentionality, meaning like looking at what the student needs, maybe both as a group and as the individuals, and how when you pick the problems with intentionality, you can also use that information as formative assessment to kind of determine what the kids need, because maybe there's something that they need that you weren't anticipating that will help you make that decision about when to spiral back.
Those are some deep takeaways. I think you've nailed it talking about purposeful practice there for sure. We are looking forward to having you back on the show. We know that we can talk so much more about these ideas, and I think the people listening would love to hear that too. Michael, we want to thank you for joining us on the podcast. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your summer and back to school. And I hope all goes well for you back to school in August. We're recording right now. It's in June. So only about a month left for your summer vacation. Hope you enjoy that.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. We'll be in touch to get you hooked up for another time slot to come join us. We are really excited to carry on this conversation. Thanks a ton.
Thank you.
As always, both John and I learn so much from these Math Mentoring Moment episodes. But in order to ensure we hang on to this new learning instead of letting it fade away like footprints in the sand, we must reflect on what we've learned. An excellent way to ensure that learning sticks is to reflect and create a plan for yourself to take action on something that resonated with you. A great way to hold yourself accountable is to write down and even better, share it with someone, your partner, colleagues, or with the Math Moment Maker community by commenting on the show notes page, tagging @MakeMathMoments on social media, or in our free private Facebook group, Math Moment Makers K through 12.
Another great way to take action is to take the action that Michael did and do a deep dive with us in our 6-module online workshop each spring and fall, where we coach you step by step on how to create and modify your lessons to engage students, build deeper understanding of math, and promote resilience in problem solving. With over 250 educators through our program, we're confident you too can create resilient, engaged problem solvers just like Michael has learned to do.
And if taking a deep dive alone isn't enough, the workshop is accredited for 2 to 4 PD credit hours through Brandman University. If you're interested in learning more about registering, be sure to check out makemathmoments.com/online workshop.
If you want to join us on the podcast for an upcoming Math Mentoring Moment episode where you too can share a big math class struggle just like Michael did, you can apply over at makemathmoments.com/mentor. In order to ensure you don't miss out on any new episodes as they come out each week, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're liking what you're hearing, do us a huge solid by sharing the podcast with a colleague and help us reach a wider audience
Moments by leaving us a review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you're listening to this particular episode. Each and every subscribe helps.
Show notes and links to resources from this episode can be found at makemathmoments.com/episode 40. Again, that is makemathmoments.com/episode 40.
Well, until next time, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high fives for you.